My name's Andrew Drummond. I just wanted to talk about something I've been thinking about, which is applying the philosophy of Forrest Landry to education. Now, if you're at all familiar with his work, you'll know that in his philosophy he resolves the central things into axioms and modalities. And as an educator, it struck me that it's all relevant, but one in particular really explains a lot of what happens in the classroom, in pedagogy and in a learning experience of students. So to some extent, I'm just going to say like what he thinks and then sort of apply it to what happens. So look at the three circles in the middle of the slide. And if you think about these are three things that have to happen in a certain order, and the order's not reversible. And what order do they have to happen in? One of them is a review of theories of learning. One of them is just learning, and one of them is a theory of learning. This is one of those kind of stop the tape things and sort of like put them in order, but you've probably done it already. So, learning must come before a theory of learning. So the experience of learning, the upfront, we are apprehending things, cognition is taking place, precedes a theory of learning. A theory of learning is a higher sort of abstract level where you then look back down the mountain, you say, oh God, what were we doing? What did we do? Oh, grammar translation. So, you know, you know, in classrooms, people are translating things before retrospectively, you know, that is called grammar translation. I don't cite that as an example that I know historically to be true, but it just seems likely, and you can probably follow what I mean. The practice is first, and then there's some kind of overview of it. And then once there's one theory of learning, there could be more than one theory, and then it's possible that theories of learning can be compared and a review of theories of learning can take place. So in this way you can see that, you know, the right up front in your face learning happens first, and then there's sort of a reflective perspective on it in some ways, a theory, what were we doing, what should we be doing, what could we be doing, and then there's more than one of them and they can be compared. This relates to Landry's work and I'll try and explain how. So just to mention about the person himself, I don't know him, but I've read two of his main works, and I've watched the sort of things on YouTube, his conversations. He does lots of things, but one of them is, one of the fundamental things is he's written a text called An Immanent Metaphysics, which metaphysics is something that precedes physics and precedes other forms of knowing. In sciences and so on, where a systemic view of sort of like reality really is put forward. This, because it's fundamental, it applies, I mean, this is according to Landry, it applies, you know, everywhere. So it applies in learning. It's not really a learning theory, but it's just being applied to learning by me, if you know what I mean. Although learning, you know, when you talk about learning, you're talking about sort of like becoming in a way. And for Landry, being, sort of like doing leads to being, and then being leads to becoming, and there's nothing you can do about it, and it's good, you know. So, becoming is, you know, learning is becoming. So this is really central, and it's central, you know. When you pick up sort of like what he's saying, it does actually stand relevant in lots of contexts. So the work itself is both an epistemology, sort of a theory of knowledge, and an ontology, a theory of what exists. You know, to some extent, when you ask Landry, you know, like what exists or like what is, you know, his answer is a system, and it's a system that works like this. He's not ruling out that there could be some underlying intelligence of the universe or something like that. As far as I know, he sort of does believe it, but doesn't emphasise it. But he wants to emphasise the systemic view, which is kind of like, if you know how the system works, you can save a lot of time and energy and get straight to the heart of doing, being, becoming, creativity, and ultimately choice making, which is important to him. So I've got to define three words now, which are very central in what he calls Axiom 2, one of the main things he's putting forward as something that is, a system that genuinely is, a system that cannot not be, and a system that is sort of behind lots of things. So the word he uses for one of these things is immanent. Now, immanent here holds something of the sense of the common sense of the word, if you know it. So something which is immanent is right before your eyes and ears. It is happening now, unfolding in your experience now. And to some extent, although it obviously something that's happening now, you will have associations, there's a part of it which you receive in an unconditioned perception. So such as sound effects. I'll just play a few sound effects now, just to get that feeling of something that's unfolding now. And this partly works, if it works, because you don't know what's going to happen, do you? You don't know what sound effects. So you have to be prepared in a space of perception for something that you'll hear and that I guess you'll try and recognise. That's just a few of them. A couple of them, probably due to resolution, don't sound that different, but what you were having anyway was an immanent experience of listening and recognising or not recognising sounds. Immanent. So then he goes on to omniscient. And if you've got any sort of background in Christian theology, you might have heard this word. Omniscient in Christian tradition means all-knowing, and it's applied to God. Landry doesn't really use it in that way. So what he's talking about is a level of generalization that occurs when you've been exposed to something for long enough. So if you remember, he'll go, doing leads to being and being leads to becoming. So for Landry, you do, and then being arises out of that. So in the same way, we had all those immanent things, and then at some point, an overview or a generalization of in one's perception really occurs, and that he would regard as omniscient. So here I've described it as a knowing about a class of tangible things. Oh, these are tables. A generalization about a set you have experienced. Oh, cold days like this, let's have a cocoa. A perspective about a set that the individual components of the set could not have. Which kind of just means you're, to some extent, outside of it. And that's the word omniscient. So here's an example. I teach literature, among other things, so here's an example from literature. Imagine you're reading a war poem and teacher puts these examples on the board. Look at these examples from the poem. A blood-soaked uniform, bones strewn across no man's land, days without food, a mine blew his leg off. Terrible things, and not to make light of it. Now, for some students, that might be enough examples. For some, it might not. But what the question, which you can see in the circle here, is a focus, is a pedagogic focus, saying you've had that many examples, now generalise. So you're trying to elicit, or let's say provide the conditions whereby an omniscient level of thinking or awareness can arise in the student. You can't really teach them that. Their mind, their kind of consciousness has to do it, but you can create the conditions for it. So you might say, what do these examples have in common? You can do that now if you want. Stop the tape. I mean, they're all seriously negative experiences, producing horror, fear, pain. So something like the horror of war is something that often comes out when you look at First World War poetry as an omniscient level view of lots of words. I mean, reading a word is an immanent experience. Leg off, blood. But as you read enough of them, a level of generalization becomes possible. And that level of thinking, that perception or awareness is omniscient for Landry. Now, transcendent is also a word that people with a background in Christianity or theology will know. And in the Trinity, the Father is the transcendent one. So, like, you can't see him. The Son is the kind of manifest one, more of a sort of an immanent one. In that sense, Jesus sort of comes to earth or what have you. So, transcendent for Landry, to some extent, has that meaning, but to some extent, in some contexts certainly, it's referred to as more of an understandable, or sort of perceivable in this dimension anyway, cognitive sort of perception type process, and one that's central in learning and in assessment. So a simple way of looking at this is that it's a second tier abstraction. We've already abstracted when we looked at this poem, we said the horrors of war. Now the poet didn't say horrors of war. That's a level of generalization that a thinking process, a thought process has applied to it. Now that's not the last level of abstraction you can do, because when there's more than one abstraction, abstractions can combine. And a level of abstraction based on the first level of abstractions can occur. And I know that sounds a bit like, you know, one of those things that's difficult to understand, but I'll try and explain it a bit more. So you need 2 or 3 omniscient observations. And then once you have that, you compare them, and this leads to a new thought or a new perspective. So let's say you had your war poetry here. There's a set of war poems, and the horror of war appears, you know, in many of those poems. And I haven't got a visual example, but let's say in another set of poems that this is sort of interlaced with kind of boredom experiences, sort of sitting around, playing the harmonica, you know, writing letters, not knowing what to do. So then that can lead to a comparison of 2 things: an omniscient perspective that the poetry has a layer of the horror of war, and another omniscient perspective that says that the poetry has representations of the boredom of war. And then you're going horror of war, boredom of war, paradoxical, you know, the paradoxical sense of that, or the kind of unexpectedness of it, is something that arises from a direct comparison of 2 omniscient perspectives. And this kind of adverb, you know, can signal that the writer, the thinker behind a sentence like this, First World War poetry, tends to emphasize both the horror of war, paradoxically, and the boredom of it, I think, and paradoxically the boredom of it. Then what you've got is, you know, a critical voice, which is uniting and synthesizing sort of 2 omniscient perspectives. And for Landry, that's transcendent. So this is now getting on sort of undergraduate level, sort of like thinking and writing. But it can be characteristic of sort of like year 12 or 13, depending on the board. I've got some examples of a Cambridge exam board here, where they're basically asking, can you think in a transcendent way? Can you write in a transcendent way? So I wanted to give you the words first before I showed you what Landry's Axiom 2 actually is, because without the words it won't really make any sense to you. But it's like a very distilled observation of a systemic view of learning and how perception leads from one class of things sort of levelling up, you know, from physical particularly into sort of psyche or abstraction, you know, the world of thought and so on. What we've actually dealt with is the second and third line of this. So a class of the immanent will precede an instance of the omniscient. You need a class of in-your-face things, and then you can generalise, basically. And then he says a class of the omniscient will precede an instance of the transcendent. So you need a class of those first level abstractions before you get to the next level abstractions. I'm going to talk about the first one in a minute, but it perhaps is the hardest thing to understand, and it actually borders on the esoteric to some extent. So I'm going to save that for now. So for Landry, when you talk about Axiom 2, and you say this happens, then this happens, then this happens, then that's not the end of it. It's actually, in some sense, cyclical. So there's something sort of inherently creative about this for Landry, and that's something I think that we don't always pick up on in certain forms of education. So we get to the point where critical thinking emerges, but we don't actually sort of close the loop by allowing design or creativity or intuition to function, albeit there could be some textual product, but it could be more than that, you know. And I think we're quite focused on a sort of textual output from sort of transcendent level, you know, cognition and perception, and it could be a range of other things. Trying to remember the guy's name. I'll come back to him in a minute. But so essentially, if we come to the end of Axiom 2 here, a class of the omniscient will precede an instance of the transcendent. Let's close the loop then. Let's go back to the beginning. A class of the transcendent will precede an instance of the immanent. Now, this is kind of like, you know, from Christ's prayer, you know, on earth as it is in heaven. Something is now coming down from the transcendent back into our unconditioned perception, you know, the first level, the kind of sound, thinking, seeing, doing, you know, the lower level stuff, and sort of the more embodied stuff. So what this implies to me, he doesn't really spell this out, but in the world of learning, what this to me it implies that when you spend enough time, you know, getting comparisons and syntheses of omniscient level phenomena, and you get a lot of those transcendent observations, you're now ripe for doing something creative. You're now ripe for seeing something that hasn't seen before, and the thing that you see can drop back down to an immanent level experience of people. That means it could be an image, it could be a sound, you know, it could be some kind of experience, not abstract thought now, but you know, a car park, you know, a genetically modified orange, you know, apple, that might not be a good one. A new form of poetry, you know, something that has an overall kind of objective sort of like quality to it that can be received as an immanent sort of experience. So looping, cyclical, it speaks to the design potential of analysis. Let's not stop with the analysis only. Hilary Jenks was big on this as well in her work on critical literacy. Oh, you've critiqued it, that's fine, but are you going to redesign it? That's the next step. You know, and for Landry, when you've done the groundwork, when you've done the prep, when you've got the skill, when you've built up to that a number of transcendent level sort of like cognitive or sort of psychic experiences, something's going to plop in, you know, something's going to come back down from that level that can be received and fed back into an immanent experience to raise the whole thing up. So the complexity, the density of the information, the quality of the experience, the depth of the creativity can always be increasing. And for Landry, systemically, this is always going on. And that's partly, I think, why we believe in things like lifelong learning and think learning that never needs to end, because this cycle never really ends. And the more resources you build up of an omniscient and transcendent nature, potentially the more you can speak creatively into whatever context you're in. I said I was going to put some exam questions up. So this is from a Cambridge International A-level examinations thing from literature, English literature. So for the Browning, you get this question: in what ways and with what effects does Browning present human relationships in two poems from your selection? Now, what this basically is quite clever from Cambridge, really, because they're allowing space here. The student's either going to basically make two distinct omniscient commentaries here. So, okay, once she said, okay, here's, from memory, here's two Browning poems that deal with this topic. The next thing is make omniscient observations on relationships on one poem, make omniscient comments on human relationships in the other poem. And you can stop there, and maybe if that's good, you could maybe get like a B if it's well written, or a C or whatever. But there is a capacity there for transcendent level thinking, where the omniscience in one poem and the omniscience in another becomes a means of comparison. So it could be like, the antagonism in this poem and the harmony in that poem, you know, and then wait for it, you need some kind of new thought to emerge, and hopefully it will. It could be something like, here we see contextual factors play heavily in Browning's sort of work, and he sees a causality between a good context leading to harmony and a bad one leading to, you know, disharmony. I'm not sure if that's true of Browning's work, but I just give that as an example. The other one I'll focus on now is the or one, just down here, the second one. And it says, a comment closely on Browning's presentation of the effects of music in the following extract, blah, blah, blah. So, you know, this is not actually that, but they give you an extract and then you have to make omniscient level observations about that poem. According to the thematic sort of stuff that's being done, but omniscient level stuff. So really, in one sense, the A question saying, here's an opportunity to write something of a transcendent nature, but you could just do two sort of omniscient things side by side. And B is kind of saying, well, make some omniscient generalizations, you know, analyses of the poem. But you're going to struggle to get into the transcendent realm unless there's some capacity in there for comparing different classes of things of an omniscient nature within the poem, one poem. But it's obviously easier to do that across a selection of poems. Gillian Clark follows the same pattern. If you want to identify it, stop the tape and have a look. So, I mean, we've been talking about perspectives, and here's just some perspectives on what I've said, and I think what happens when you start thinking about Landry in education. One of them is, how do we know what other people think? You know, and in the great sort of onslaught of STEM into education and everywhere else, big data's not really going to tell you about the qualitative experience of a group of other people. Literature does, poetry does. In the internal form of it, the written word carries that more effectively, the psychological reality in some sense, than the visual. So literature kind of pokes its sort of chest out and kind of says, look, we're here, you can't take us out the cultural equation. I think that's very important. Forgive the typo. How many examples must precede a generalization? So we're saying, you know, what does a student need really in order for omniscient thought to occur? And I would say that mostly we rush this, it's hurried, they don't have enough space, they don't know that they're examples of something, they're not grouped together, and they're not given enough space to get to the point where an omniscient observation will occur. This also pertains to the cultural level. I mean, we're all living and surrounded by culture now. And I think one of the things that, you know, is interesting in this is that you can sort of reverse engineer this process to see how new forms emerge. So in my lifetime, when I was young, there was a form of music called ska that emerged in London, which was an incredible sort of, you know, bands like the Specials, Madness, and the Selector, and I've forgotten some of the important ones, Bad Manners, and it's kind of like how Caribbean music, reggae, came into an urban context, and that first generation of mixing, that beautiful mixing between that culture and the white culture that was there at the time, and this sort of hybrid music, but something that transcended some of its parts. You can you can reverse engineer that and see Axiom 2 very much in place. What benefits accrue from multiple perspectives on the same thing? Well, to sort of misquote or quote Daniel Schmachtenberger, he's got a project called a Consilience Project, which is basically a public, a social, institutional exercise in, you know, practicing how do you apply multiple perspectives on the same thing in order to arrive at a deeper understanding of it. That's something Axiom 2 helps with, and also the kinds of skills that develop educationally in the sort of humanities and in critical thinking around that. How is design informed by analysis? If Axiom 2 is the case, and it's a systemic view of how kind of things are in the deepest possible way, then to close the loop, you need to go beyond analysis into design and close the loop. Allow the creative thing to happen that comes back into the immanent experience. Students can take away something in their eyes, in their ears, on paper, colourful, a form, a vision, anything like that of an immanent nature, which is led from a series of transcendent sort of level cognitions. What can we do in class to help facilitate transcendent thought? To some extent, the design of the materials needs to be central here. So, for example, in English language teaching, you have embedded grammar. So you haven't, say, formally taught a certain tense, but that tense appears 10 times in the text. Students read the text and there's some level of comprehensibility. And then drawing attention to it, and those framing questions come about where it's kind of like, oh, did you notice this structure? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, time and space. What do you notice? What can you see? Compare, and comparison is central for Landry. Compare this to something else. Compare the context. What do you think it means? Compare the form. Okay, now what does that tense mean? You basically have you taught it? You facilitated them kind of like feeling it, seeing it, knowing it. And that seems to be a way where learners are really connecting with everything and not necessarily, when you're spoon feeding, you don't really know, do you? But like that, you definitely would know. What learning or developmental stages must precede transcendent level writing and thinking? Well, there's a number of things on there. I mean, there's all the sort of Piaget type stages, where you go to sort of concrete operational, and there's language acquisition, attunement to sort of social contexts. The institution has to be sort of functional, effective filters. It needs to be safe, basically, and so on and so on. And then a well-structured curriculum, and so on. At a certain point, will lead to this. I mean, I pointed to the fact that even in year 13, as we call it, Cambridge don't quite give you an all-out transcendent only question. There's a question there that you can answer in a transcendent way. So I think when you're looking at this border between A levels at IB and then undergrad, or however it's termed in other contexts, but the sort of stepping stones towards university type work is coming in then and will be fully instantiated there. So I guess in a secondary context, it'd be a case of, to those who can, let's take them there, and to those who are still going there, we put the blocks in place to enable them to get through. I fully recommend Landry's work. A lot of it applies very much to education, and I hope you have a good look at it.